Welcome, everyone. My name is Maria Tranquilli, and I'm a program manager at the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center. For those of you who may not know, the NASDAQ Center is a nonprofit dedicated to enabling entrepreneurs from all over the world to realize their maximum potentials and grow. We will open up for live Q&A at the end of this event. Please submit your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout this presentation. And none of what we do could be possible without all of the amazing support from our sponsors. We are humbled by their contributions. During these unique times, we are curious about how sentiment is among you in our community. And we would like to start by taking 2 different polls to see how you're feeling. Launching poll number 1, how are you currently feeling? Are you feeling fearful, anxious, surviving, or optimistic? Please let us know. Sharing those results, it looks like we have a lot of optimism in the room today. Fantastic. We have one additional poll. What is keeping you up at night? Is it finance, sales, or marketing? Is it scaling, pivoting, your team, or surviving? Wonderful, everyone. Sharing those results, it looks like marketing is foremost in keeping everyone up at night, followed by sales and finance. Thank you all so much for sharing. And without further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our special guest, Emily Heyward, co-founder and chief brand officer at Red Antler, author of Obsessed, Building a Brand People Love from Day One. Emily, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Absolutely. We are so pumped that you're here with us today. We have so many great questions during this fireside chat, specifically about your excellent book that is out. So for everyone here, just a few housekeeping tips. If you would like to share in the chat, make sure you're selecting the blue button that says all panelists and attendees. So everyone that is currently in attendance can read your responses or your thoughts. We would love to hear them. And again, at the bottom of the screen, if you'd like to submit questions for Emily for review, we will make sure to ask those questions later on, and or we will weave that through the conversation that Emily and I have. Please submit those in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We absolutely would love to hear from you. And finally, if someone feels brave and would like to share their own voice, raise your hand and we absolutely can make sure to unmute you and you can ask Emily a question yourself. Emily, are you ready to dive in? We have so many questions.
Let's do it. Hopefully we can help everyone sleep a little better tonight if marketing is what's keeping them awake. So consider this your relaxing chamomile tea.
Oh, I love it. I love it. All right, let's head in. So first and foremost, I love to dive in with this question. Tell me something that's true that almost no one agrees with you on, Emily.
Well, I'm going to say that I find most people that I interact with in my day-to-day life think that growth and performance marketing are distinct from brand marketing. And my feeling is that they should be seen as one and the same. And happy to talk more about that, but that's my quick answer of a falsehood that I would like to dispel.
Oh, that is so interesting. Actually, I feel like maybe we should ask you to dive a little bit deeper into that, if you don't mind, right off the bat.
Absolutely. So, at my company, Red Antler, we work primarily with early stage startups. I've seen many, many, many companies go through the journey of launching and then immediately having to start growing and scaling, right? It feels like it happens overnight. And a lot of money and time gets funneled into performance marketing, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because at the end of the day, you need to be able to justify your marketing spend and you need to be proving ROI, and ultimately you need to be driving conversion. But what I find is unfortunate is that the performance team, the growth-oriented team, often actually sits separately from the brand team, and the budgets are also treated as 2 different budgets. And I believe that the best performance marketing is obviously effective and measurable, but can be brand additive instead of taking away from a larger narrative. And I think too often teams feel they need to choose between, are we using this moment to tell our brand story, to build love, to sort of further our overarching narrative, or are we using this moment to convert people into customers and to drive sales? And I think if we could see those as one thing, one goal, we'd see more effective performance marketing. I think right now the things that are being tested against each other are like kind of decent to bad versus, decent to excellent. And if we put more money into the creative side of things, we would find that actually it also drives performance.
Emily, thank you so much. So much wisdom just in the first few moments of being together. So for everyone that is here with us, please make sure you're submitting your questions in the Q&A and or the chat. I know for a fact that a lot of the founders within our community are very curious and likely will have questions about deeper resolution into what you just mentioned, Emily. So moving into you describing Red Antler and what your challenges as a founder have been. So Red Antler, your company and industry powerhouse, started as a scrappy creative labor of love. We know this. And you've been defined by leveraging the power of branding to drive growth and scale for early stage companies, exactly what you just shared with us. You've designed and launched brand identities for companies like Casper and Allbirds. What do you wish you could have known 13 years ago when you started Red Antler? What were some of your biggest challenges when you became a founder?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure this is very common to the founder experience, but I think that, it took us a long time to be able to afford more senior talent. So it was really more of like an internal scaling and growth challenge. I think that in the early years, we were so conscious about keeping our overhead down because we never raised outside capital. And, we were always worried about like, where's the next client coming from? And therefore, where's the next paycheck coming from? And we were able to get really far with like a very young junior team, including ourselves, by the way. I was pretty young when I started the company. But I feel looking back that if we had taken a little bit more of a leap and brought on more senior leadership earlier, it would have just made everything else so much easier. Like, I feel like we went through growing pains that we probably didn't need to go through just because we didn't have the experience and we weren't able or didn't surround ourselves with people who did have the experience. And now that I have leaders at the table who know more than I do and realize how refreshing that is and what a weight off my shoulders it is, I wish we had done that sooner. Like, I wish we had been brave enough to make some key senior hires even before we were sure we could afford to, because I think that it would have made everything else just so much easier and smoother.
That is very sage advice. Surround yourself with people who know more than you early on so that you're not struggling in the beginning. That's fantastic. Absolutely. And then how has the arc of your leadership style changed? It sounds like you had a lot of growth, especially in the beginning. So we're really curious.
So I think that in the early days, well, again, I think a lot of people probably go through this, but I first had to evolve from doing to managing, right? In the beginning, like, I was doing all the creative, I was writing all the copy, I was singularly responsible for the brands that we were putting out into the world, and then had to find a way to sort of feel the same sense of pride and ownership from managing a team. And I was sitting incredibly closely with that team and training them every single day and giving constant feedback and having a ton of sort of on the fly one-on-one interactions. Now, we're at over 100 people. So I'm still very involved in the work. Most of my job is still involved in the day-to-day guiding the work, but it's not the same, like, sit next to someone and collaborate together, right? I really need to think about, how do we scale the way we think? How do we make sure that people understand our values and our approach to creativity, even if they don't have the benefit of like literally rolling up their sleeves and me and them are like making something together.
I love that. It sounds like you applied the process that you currently have with your clients to your own business very early on.
Yeah, we have to.
Mm-hmm. And that leads me to our next question. Why do you love working with founders, specifically in the earlier stages?
Oh, it's so exciting working with founders. So just a little bit of background. Before I started Red Antler, I worked in traditional advertising, and I was working for big corporate companies on big brands doing national TV campaigns, global brands. A lot of these brands had been around sometimes like 100 years, and met, incredibly intelligent people But there's just a difference between being a brand manager who's been hired to do a job and you know that you're going to be like rotating off that brand in a year or two versus having it be your baby. And for me, the passion that founders bring to the table, the stakes are so high. You know, they've left behind a corporate job, they've left behind a steady paycheck, they're sacrificing everything to bring this business into the world. And they're doing it because they see no other choice, right? They feel this burning drive that the problem that they're solving needs a solution and the business that they're building needs to exist. And to me, that creates such a more exciting and inspiring energy. You know, I really want to be working with people who care so deeply about what we're doing and who are willing to take risks because they know that actually they can't afford to play it safe.
Oh my gosh, taking risks is such a big, actually, I have some really interesting live questions, Emily, and I'm wondering specifically about risk and about pulling in, hold on one moment, give me 1 second, from Yasuko. I know, Yasuko, you had raised your hand, and I'm actually curious if you would like to share your voice here. Let me see. Yasuko, feel free to raise your hand either now or later, but I'm happy to ask your question for you. Emily, the question from Yasuko, and I know that others are actually curious about this. When were you able to hire senior level talent at Red Antler, and what made you do so? What was the thing that showed you? What was the timing, and why did you know it was the right time?
So, like I said, I think we were too late. Not too late in like some doomsday way, right? Obviously, we're doing fine, but we waited longer than I would have. And I think that when we finally did it, it was because things had gotten really, really painful, specifically for me and my co-founder, who felt like we were needed to solve every single problem. You know, there was never a feeling that like if we weren't in the room, it would get done anyway. And truthfully, we were facing challenges that we had never done before. You know, we didn't know how to profitably operate a 50-person company, now a 100-person company. And as things got more and more complex, we realized that, you know, there were probably people who had solved some of these problems before that would make it a whole lot easier, right? I think that every single time we felt like we were starting from scratch and we were like, there's probably people out here who kind of know the answers to this. And, you know, it's tricky because I think a lot of our success has actually come from doing things differently and not following the rules of our industry. And in some ways that was easier because we didn't even really know the rules of our industry. So it was easier to break them. So I do think there's a tension there. And what you don't want to do is like so quickly surround yourself by people that are set in a certain way of doing things that are going to hold you back from innovating. But I think that once we were seeing the traction that we were seeing and feeling like there were better places for us to be spending our time than just constant troubleshooting, that was when it became really clear that we needed help.
Oh, this is fantastic. So we have another follow-up question, Emily, because this is such a rich topic and you have so much experience as a founder. Which senior level role did you hire first?
Well, I think the two that that stand out the most, who have had the most impact on our business, are ops. So someone who can really be driving process and profitability. And then the other, and this we waited way too long, and I wish we had done it sooner, is people. Hiring like a chief people officer has been transformative to our business because we have someone who has experience, again, the experience that I don't personally have, of thinking every day about career growth, retention, you know, how do we keep our team happy? You know, especially for us, right? We're in a talent business. Our people are our business, but for any business, holding on to good talent is make or break. And I look back on people we lost through the years who moved on to other opportunities, and I'm like, could we have kept them? And that would have ultimately been less expensive too than replacing them if we had had someone senior who was really focused on that part of the business.
Emily, thank you so much for sharing this wisdom and expertise. We're getting some great feedback here. Thank you everyone for joining us. And for anyone that's joined us late, just a few housekeeping tips. Please put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and or in the chat. We would be happy to voice those to Emily as we go. Emily, again, we have great feedback here, a lot of positive positive comments around how relevant this is and how exciting this conversation is so far. So thank you again for being here with us. Let's dive into, now I know you've shared a lot about your founder story just in the first few moments, but let's move into some branding and marketing, specifically why you're here and why you have written this incredible book, Obsessed. What are some typical branding traps that founders fall into? Can you share those with us?
So I think the first is that most people confuse the expressions of a brand with the brand itself. And what I mean by that is I'll meet founders all the time who say, I already have a brand because I have a name and I have a logo. Or maybe they've taken it one step forward. They're like, well, I've got my name and my logo and my colors, so I'm good with my brand. What I really need help with is X, Y, and Z. And for us, what we believe is that brand actually needs to go much deeper than that. And that ultimately the definition of branding is really what your business stands for at its core. Understanding through and through who are the people you need to reach, what's the deep, meaningful problem that you're solving for them, and then how can you stand for an idea that answers that problem? And that idea needs to be infused through every single touch point, including your internal team. So it's much, of course, design is important. Design is an incredibly important way to tell people what you're all about and to create a feeling with your target audience. But your brand is also your customer service team, your digital experience, what it feels like if you have a physical product, like when it arrives in the mail, if it's a digital product, like what are the interactions, right? Like what's the user experience? That's all brand and it all matters. And it all ultimately ladders up to helping people understand why they should care and why they should choose you over anyone else. So it's essential. And I think that I see a lot of early stage founders who ask me the question of like, look, I get it. I get that it's important, but I'm bootstrapping and I can't invest in that right now. I'm going to deal with it later. And my feeling is, if you don't figure that out from the beginning, you're leaving so much opportunity on the table, because ultimately what brand is creating a simple, compelling story about why people should want to engage with you. And if you're not doing that, how can you expect to gain momentum and to grow your audience and to grow a winning business?
Emily, thank you so much. I think that you have absolutely defined what some of the common branding traps that founders fall into. So follow up to that, and we have lots of questions around this. Branding strategy. Can you take us through some of the fundamental steps of branding strategy that all founders need to know? And I know that some of this is outlined in your book. So we would love to hear, and also we'll put a link to the book in the chat. I know a lot of people are asking, what is the process? What is the process? So let's have you describe that here. We'll link your book in the chat for anyone that wants to dive deeper.
Yes. So first and foremost, it always starts with defining your target audience. And by that, I don't mean your total addressable market. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be demographically driven. I think the most important thing to identify from the beginning is who are the people who are going to love you the most? Like, who are the people who are going to just become your biggest fans? Like, who is this business for? Not that you're not going to end up reaching more people too, because it can feel scary leaving opportunity on the table, but you've got to have a really clear picture of who this business is like most going to solve a problem for, who's going to fall in love with you. And then from there, and I mentioned this quickly earlier, what's the problem that you're solving for them? And how can you go deeper and really uncover a human truth that your business can be an answer to? So I think a lot of times, I'll meet a founder and I'll say, what's the problem that you're solving for people? And they'll answer with a solution. This happens like 99 times out of 100. It always amazes me. But I'll say, what's the problem you're solving? They'll say, oh, I'm solving the problem of, data visibility for small businesses, or I'm solving the problem of, a more convenient way to buy dog food. And those aren't problems, right? Those are business ideas. So instead, you have to stop being self-serving about it and really think like, even if this business didn't exist, like what's this person suffering from or wishing for or needing more of in their life? And then that can lead you into your brand strategy. And really that should uncover the bigger idea that you want to stand for. So I'll give an example just because I think that's helpful. This is not a client, but I write about this example in my book just because I think it's such a good one, which is Airbnb. So when they first launched, they were very much being positioned as like a cheaper alternative to a hotel, or like a place to stay when hotels in San Francisco were sold out during a conference, or even like have a kitchen, whatever, right? These very functional benefits. And then as they were growing, they did a massive global study among their core audience and found the problem that they were actually solving for people was much deeper than that. And it was really about this human need to belong. You know, when we think about when we travel, no one wants to feel like an outsider, right? You don't want to feel like a tourist. Everyone has that moment of pride when they stumble upon a place that's only locals. And by uncovering that that was the true problem that they were solving for people, it unlocked a whole new phase of growth for their business. You know, they redid their brand to stand for belonging. It opened up new features like experiences, and they were able to really define a brand positioning that was just so much more emotionally driven than their competitors like VRBO and HomeAway.
I love that example, Emily, and I know that our audience does as well. And to share, just to really push that point forward, we know at NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center that developing a deep sense of belonging within our entrepreneurial and founder community is actually what helps founders not feel isolated, not feel so alone on that journey that you mentioned earlier is so deeply difficult. So developing that sense of belonging, I think in any community, like you're mentioning, is actually what is necessary for traction, for sales, things like that. Really excellent. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness, so many questions here. Let's see, moving forward, we have lots of excitement. We're so grateful all of you are here with us. Again, please make sure you're putting your questions in the Q&A and in the chat. I will make sure to weave all of those questions into the live discussion with Emily, and we absolutely will open up later for Q&A. So Emily, you spoke about a few fundamentals and steps of brand strategy. I want to dive into one that you mentioned, which is consumer research or customer research, knowing that it's one of the biggest hurdles that our founders face. So we have a twofold topic question here, if you're open to that.
Yes.
Okay, great. So why is consumer research so important to branding, growth, and scale? That's question number one. And then later, we would like to know some tactical methods on how to best obtain that information and then use that in a retention process for our customers.
Yeah, so that's a meaty question. I'll try to unpack it into sort of digestible tidbits here. So first is when you're first getting started, right? And I see in founders a strong bias towards quantitative research, which I would also like to dispel. So quantitative research, just for those of you who are not familiar with the jargon, would be, you know, speaking to a large, statistically significant sample of people, let's say over 200 people, or even better, over 300 people, and being able to form conclusions that count as data. Like 67% of people believe that X, right? And I think quantitative research can be incredibly valuable in the very, very early phases when you're trying to figure out, like, is there even a market here? Like, how many people are shopping for X, you know? And a lot of that, frankly, is available through, like, you know, third-party sources. Like, you can buy studies. You don't necessarily even need to conduct that research on your own, right? But you obviously want to go through the diligence of, like, sizing your market, understanding, like, does this person I have in my head even exist at a size and a scale that, like, makes this worth founding? After that, though, and by the time we come into the process, we actually find a lot more value from qualitative research, which involves speaking one-on-one with people and getting what we call insights. And that refers, you know, to what I was talking about earlier, sort of going deeper than the surface. And when you do qualitative research, it doesn't count as data, right? You can't talk to 12 people and then say 50% of people think X, right? You can't extrapolate from it in a statistically significant way. But what you can do is, like, get out of your own head, challenge your own assumptions, and go a lot deeper beneath the surface about what's driving people at an emotional level. And for us, that's typically what unlocks those, like, amazing moments when you're like, oh, I thought that what was motivating people here is X, but it's actually Y. Or, like, we never realized the sort of the nuance of this problem. And it leads you down, like, a much more interesting, emotionally resonant path that, to me, leads you to a much more interesting and ownable brand strategy. Do you want me to give another example? Tell me if my answers are too long. I know we have so many questions. I want to make sure we get to them, but I think it is helpful to sort of hear these examples. So we helped launch Keeps, which is a brand in the men's hair loss space. The strategy of Keeps was to go after men who were in their, like, early 20s, late 20s, who had just started to lose their hair, but had not yet taken action. And all of us thought that the reason why these younger men were not engaging in the hair loss category was because of stigma and embarrassment, right? The existing brands in the space are super dusty and kind of corny and old, and no one was really targeting the younger man. And we did consumer research, qualitative research, spoke to men who fit our target, which was, younger men losing their hair, not yet taking action. And what we learned from our research was this thing that we had never thought of going in, which is that men were like, you know what? I know I'm going bald, but like, I'm not going to deal with it till it's really a problem. It's sort of similar to how the guys are like, I don't go to the doctor unless my arm is like falling off, or like, I'm not going to ask for directions unless I'm like literally driving into a lake. So they're like, I'm going to do it, but I'm just not going to do it yet. And the problem with that approach is you actually can't grow hair back. You can only prevent hair loss. So all these men were like, once I'm really bald, I'll deal with it. Didn't realize that like, it's actually too late. So our task then became, how do we take this inertia and almost this sense that like, I don't want to seem vulnerable by asking for help, and turn it into a strength for the brand? And the whole brand identity became around like being proactive. Our brand strategy was like for the man of action. And we turned it into this point of pride of like, you're a guy who like gets it done. Like you're going to take care of it before it's too late. So we never would have gotten to that brand positioning if we hadn't done research and talked to people who weren't us. And it sort of gave us this spark that ended up becoming the basis for the brand.
Thank you so much, Emily. We're hearing, yes, more examples, please. We love to hear these examples. So absolutely. And we have lots of questions specifically about the companies that you have worked with. So we'll get to some of those later. Specifically though, what we're hearing or what our audience is asking, how do you think founders can read between the lines? Let's say that they've done some interviewing, they've had some surveys filled out. How might they read between the lines to understand true customer motivation or true customer triggers, as one attendee put it?
It's not easy. And truthfully, like research is a skill like anything else. And, I have definitely reviewed discussion guides that founders will send me to look at because they're planning to conduct their own research. They don't want to pay an outside partner. And it's amazing to me how many leading questions are in these guides. So I'll give an example without naming the brand, but I had a founder send me a discussion guide. And the very first question was like, how do you feel about supporting a women-led, minority-led business? And I'm like, don't bring that up. Like, see if it comes up on its own. Like the second you ask that, of course, people are going to be like, oh, I feel great about supporting a women-led business. No, I mean, I hope no one's going to be like, would rather, give money to just dudes. But, even just by the way that it was phrased, you're sort of leading the witness, right? Like you're putting an idea in their head that wasn't necessarily there coming into the conversation. And I think instead it's so important to keep things as open-ended as possible and sort of see where people take you and, take good notes. And obviously you can ask follow-up questions, but what you don't want to do is go in with too many hypotheses that you're trying to prove or disprove. I think you've really got to be open and listen. And then once you've spoken to sort of 1, 2, 10 people, that's when themes start to emerge and you can start to say, interesting. Like everyone was saying this, like, what does that actually mean? And that's where you draw out those insights and those deductions. But it's not easy. And, I would definitely recommend, even if it's not a professional moderator, finding someone to conduct the research who isn't you. Because I think that it's just nearly impossible to go in as a founder and not find that you're like kind of plugging your business and sort of, interjecting with benefits, even if you don't realize that you're doing it.
Emily, thank you so much. So such a great overview. I think that we know that customer research, consumer research is such an important and pivotal place for founders to do their work. It sounds like you're also referencing that it really dictates how a founder moves forward when it comes to brand positioning, voice, scaling, sales. Is that right?
It can. I mean, truthfully, there are brands we've launched where we didn't do any research. And, Allbirds is one of them. It's a phenomenally successful business. And in the onset, we didn't do any research because we felt we understood our audience and the problem that we were solving, and that wasn't the complicated part. So I think that, there can be an over-reliance on research too, and expecting that like consumers are going to tell you the answer, and that's not always going to be the case. But I think that whenever you're treading into territory that either is like outside your comfort zone, or if you don't directly represent your target audience, or you're worried that you're making assumptions that aren't necessarily true, that's when research can be incredibly valuable. Now, once you're growing and scaling, you reach a point where you actually can test in live environments, which is a whole other thing, right? And I think that it can be incredibly effective to actually be like running different ads and seeing which one works better. Because as much as you can sort of try to plan good research and not be leading, there's always going to be like just the influence of being in a research environment, and people like to see themselves in a light that might not actually be accurate to what their behavior is. Like everyone's going to tell you they'd spend more for a sustainable product. That's not always true, right? So I think that you reach a point where actually it's less about research and it's more about testing, and those are two different things.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think moving into our next question, what are some tactical steps to designing value proposition? And is it correct, as you mentioned, around consumer research, to define our value proposition based on that research? Or as you just mentioned, in some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. And how do we define the difference?
So we think of value propositions as supporting points to your overarching brand idea. So the goal would be to come up with an umbrella idea of what your brand stands for, and then the value props support it, right? So I'll go back to Allbirds because I just mentioned them. The overarching idea for that brand was about curiosity and adventure. And the value props, comfort, right? The shoes are incredibly comfortable. For those of you who are not familiar with Allbirds, they're a footwear brand that's rooted in a mission of sustainability. So the shoes are comfortable, you can throw them on, nothing's holding you back, you can kind of go out and see the world. The sustainability mission supports that idea of adventure and curiosity because the company itself is sort of out there seeking new uses for the world's most renewable materials. And then, depending on where the brand is appearing and why, we'll sort of emphasize one value prop versus another. But rather than seeing it like you just need to choose one, it's really like, what's the through line, that bigger brand idea that can be supported by the different value props. Whether or not those come from research, I don't think you're going to have much success running a survey where you're like, hey, rank these 5 benefits and we'll decide which one is most important to people. I just don't think consumers have enough self-awareness of what actually motivates them to be able to do that in a survey, right? Like certain things are always going to rise to the top. Like price is always going to rise to the top. That doesn't mean that you want to build a brand where the idea is price. Same thing for convenience, right? Like every brand needs to be more convenient these days, and people are going to say, oh, that's what matters most. And then when in the reality, like there are other things that drive them. So I think it has to be a combination of understanding what you want to stand for overall, and then sort of depending on where you're appearing, what are the most important levers to push or pull in that moment.
Thank you so much. So achieving a balance, it sounds, is very important here.
Yeah, I think balance and just what's appropriate in the context. Like occasionally you might want to run an ad that's about price. Like if it's very down the funnel and like you're at the moment where you're trying to convert someone, and like that's great, but that doesn't mean that, the big headline when someone gets to your homepage should be about price.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And when it comes to balance, I know in your book, Obsessed, Building a Brand People Love from Day One, you speak about the perfect balance between functional benefits versus self-expressive or emotional benefits. And I'm wondering maybe if you want to dive a little bit deeper here into that.
Yeah, so actually, my feeling is that the more we can stop thinking of those as two separate things, the better off we'll be. And a lot of times founders will ask me, like, how do I balance my functional benefits with my emotional story? Or, how do I balance my mission with, my product attributes, right? And I think it used to be like back in the day when branding was first invented, that those were two different things, right? Like you'd have a product and the product did whatever it does. And then the point of branding and advertising was to come up with like a fun, engaging story that people would associate with the product. So think about like Coca-Cola, and it stands for happiness, right? I mean, why, right? It's sugar water, but sure. Or like cigarettes, even better example, standing for like coolness, There's no real connection between the product and the emotional story other than the fact that it was told that way. I think now we're living in an era where consumers are so much more discerning. They have so much more information, so much more control, that we really have to think about an emotional story that's pulled out from the functional benefits. Like, it all needs to be connected. I don't think we can just invent an emotional story and try to attach it to what the product does. I think the emotional story needs to be backed up by how the product actually like behaves and what it delivers. And once you're able to do that, you're no longer asking yourself, like, is today the day I'm going to show up and try to get someone to fall in love with me? Or is today the day I'm going to show up and tell them like what this product does, right? Instead, you can tell what the product does in a way that's emotionally driven.
Is really helpful. And I know within our community, we have some specific questions around this, how it relates or is connected to culture and cultural narratives and cultural tensions. And I wonder if it has to do with what you mentioned in Obsessed and the rule of consistency, and whether the rule of consistency makes brands more sophisticated and how we might use that rule. So if you don't mind maybe explaining that rule and speaking to, cultural narratives and tensions that might overlay our branding identity.
Yeah, definitely. So the point that I make in the book is that I think that, again, going back to like the olden times, all 10 years ago, before this startup explosion and before, the real, you know, handheld internet, et cetera. I think that, you know, the branding 101 was like show up consistently. Like that's what branding is, right? Like pick your message, stick to it. Just like as long as you are sort of consistent across the board, you're doing a fine job. I think now brands need to appear in so many places. And each of those places has its own set of rules. I don't know if all of you saw the meme that people were doing about themselves that was like Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Snapchat, right? Or TikTok. I mean, that's true for brands too. Like you don't want to appear the same way on LinkedIn as you do in an Instagram story. And it's okay for brands to like have that flex, to respond to things that are happening in culture, to be relevant in the moment and not feel like they're veering off track. Now, in order to do that well, though, you need to have an incredibly clear idea of like what your North Star is, because otherwise it just seems like you're all over the place. So it starts by really understanding like, this is what we stand for at our core. And that actually gives you the freedom to behave in different ways. And like, think about your friends. Like you're going to show up a different way at the fun barbecue as you are at like the corporate cocktail party. That doesn't make you, a false person, right? It actually makes you like a more relatable, likable person.
Thank you so much for answering that, Emily. And I know that we have quite a few social entrepreneurs in our audience and individuals that are founders that are really also focused on social issues. So one of the questions always, I would say, within our community is how do we actually take a stand for social issues without alienating our audience? And it sounds like what you just mentioned is the way to do it.
I mean, I also think sometimes you're going to alienate people, and that's okay. And I think if you really believe in these social issues, like take the stand, because if you're out there, first of all, in today's world, like there's no way to please everybody without just never saying anything. And I think it's far better to take a stand, be out there with a point of view, than to constantly be worried that you might turn people off. Because, everyone might be fine with you, but nobody's going to love you. Look at a brand like Patagonia, who I think is most people, like many, many people's most admired brand. They are never afraid to be out there with what they believe. And that's why people love them. And yeah, I'm sure there's some people who think they're assholes, but most people like love them all the more for it.
Absolutely true. Absolutely. Thank you so much for explaining that to our community. I know it's, again, a longstanding question that is asked consistently. So for all of our community that are here, don't be afraid. Take your stand is what Emily is telling us. Absolutely. And Emily, our next question, and I actually want to wrap this into 2 or 3 questions that I'm seeing live from the audience. The original question is, how can founders evaluate their own brand ideas? And what is your personal stress test? I want to combine that. I see a number of questions around Red Antler and how does Red Antler evaluate brands that you might want to invest in or you might want to take on as a client. So I think maybe if you're able or if you're willing, answering those questions simultaneously, I think that might be possible for us.
Sure. They do sound like 2 different questions to me, because the first is about a brand idea. When we're evaluating like the business idea, right? And of course they're connected, but it's not quite the same. So I'll start with how we evaluate our clients, because when our clients come to us, it's usually either they don't have a brand yet or they have one they're not happy with. So we're not so much worried about their brand idea. What we're worried about is whether we see potential in their business idea. And I'd say it's three things. One is this solving a real problem in a meaningful way? I think that we're seeing such a startup explosion. We're often meeting 3 companies within a month who are doing like basically identical things. And we want to make sure that we really see a place for this business in the world that's relevant, that's not just a copycat and not just like solving some small piece of the puzzle, but is actually going to either completely change a category or create an entirely new one. So that's one. 2, is this the team to do it? And ideally the founding team has some personal connection to what they're doing. It doesn't need to be like a family history, but like either in the industry or an experience they had versus like they just sat and brainstormed business ideas on a whiteboard. Because again, we want to work with people who are really passionate and have that driving force. And then 3, for us, we want to make sure they're nice. We're in client services and we want to work with people who are going to be respectful to our team, who believe in the power of brand, who are excited to undergo a creative process, who don't just see it as like a box to check off before they get back to the important stuff. So that's how we evaluate businesses. In terms of evaluating the brand idea, it's hard. And again, I don't think it's something that you can test. I know that people want to like sort of hedge their bets and try to get data that proves this is the right idea. But ultimately, that's not going to lead you somewhere new, because people in research are usually drawn to what's most familiar and to what they've seen before. So for us, we do a pretty wide exploratory where we're looking at cultural trends. We're looking at the category, like what's the competition saying? Where is their open space? Again, we're looking at our audience, like what do they actually care about? Like what do they need that they're not getting? And that leads us through our experience and our intuition to an idea. And we evaluate it because, we've done this many, many times before, and we can tell if something's like enough of a hook or if it's going to fall flat. It's not easy to do. And I think it's especially hard to do for yourself, right? But I think that the times we've come up with the strategies that just like, have been the most successful, the second we have them, we're like, oh, that's it. Like, we know it, it feels fresh and compelling.
I love this. Can you give us an example specifically of that time when you had a client and it might have been difficult to uncover, and then you had this aha moment, and how maybe you got there?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'll bring up Casper just because that's a brand that I think a lot of people are familiar with. And we had like an idea that we rejected before coming up with the one that we really ended up running with. So for those of you who are not familiar with Casper, online mattress company, launched in 2014. At the time, nobody was selling a mattress online. There was like one other company doing it, and all consumers had been trained they needed to like go to the showroom and sleep on a bunch of different ones to see which one was right for them. It was a horrible experience. No one liked doing it. No one could even name their mattress brand. It was just like a low consideration, painful category. And when we first started talking to the founders of Casper, all of us were like, is this just about like convenience? Like, is this just about like, it's an easier way to get to your perfect bed? It's ships in a box, it's less expensive, there's only one, they launched with just one, now they have more. And we were kind of running with that, and we were just like, like who, we even started to explore it creatively, and we're like, who cares that it's more convenient if you don't want it in the first place? Like, that's not enough to build like a leading brand on. And we went back and really looked at like the competition, what everyone was saying. We saw that there was all this pseudoscience and jargon in the category, a lot of like focus on different types of foam and different sleep numbers and all the rest. It also felt really fake. We're like, no one's talking about why you actually care about getting a good night's sleep, which is that you wake up feeling better. And we built a brand that was around this notion that better sleep leads to a more interesting and more fulfilling life. And the second we came up with that, we're like, oh, that is like a meaty idea. That is something that's unlocking so much more creativity in our team, because suddenly we built this brand that was not just about who you are when you're asleep, but actually who you are when you're awake. And there was this interesting duality, and we were able to embrace people's like quirky personalities and what they were doing with their days. And it just led us down such a more interesting path.
Absolutely. Such an interesting take specifically on sleep. And I know that we've all encountered Casper. Fantastic, Emily. Thank you so much. And I know, we're at 47 right now. We have about 13 more minutes together. So let's make sure to make the most of it. For everyone that is with us, thank you so much for being with us. Please submit your questions in the Q&A. We'll make sure to get to as many as possible. And Isis, our amazing production manager, just put in the chat a survey for all of you to fill out. So while you're listening to the rest of the conversation today, please take 2 minutes to fill out that survey. Emily and Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center would love your feedback. So Emily, let's hop in. We have some specific questions around funding and how might founders, when it is time to invest in branding, and as you mentioned earlier and advised earlier, do it early and do it likely before you believe you need to. How might you, if you have a funder, how might you let them know that you're thinking about this, or how might you justify to funders the importance of investing in branding early on?
So truthfully, I've seen a huge shift over the past 13 years of running Red Antler, that it used to be that investors were like a massive barrier when founders were wanting to spend money on brand, and investors were like, don't do that. Like, save that money, hire another engineer, like lean startup, get out there, test product market fit. We now are finding that the vast majority of investors who we have close relationships with are actually insisting that people invest in brand early. And they're sending people to us for us to evaluate the brand. And they're really understanding that these days, like, brand makes the difference, especially with how competitive things have gotten, and the fact that like everybody's coming up with the same ideas. Everybody has access to the same cultural trends that are leading them to launch, like, whatever the next big thing is. So brand really is that competitive edge. So I would say, if you've got an investor that's pushing back on the idea that brand is important, I would try to find other like corollaries to prove to them why this matters, especially like, let's say, I can't imagine an investor in the consumer space is questioning the need to invest in brand, but let's say you're in B2B or you're in, fintech or something where people maybe are a little slower to catch up to the importance of this. I would point to other examples of brands that are like adjacent in your category, or like slightly near to your category, and show how brand really did make a difference in the ones that ended up like breaking out from the pack.
Thank you so much, Emily. Fantastic advice. And again, just to reiterate to our audience, as Emily mentioned earlier, start and invest early is one of the best investments that you will make. So we have a few more minutes, 1 or 2 more questions here, and then we'll take some questions live from the audience. Emily, companies in every industry are transforming as they navigate the disruptions brought on by this pandemic. And in your book, you very clearly identify ways to transform a company towards growth and scale. So why do leaders of all organizations, from startup to mature businesses, need to think differently about heading into 2021? What advice might you give them leading into 2021?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question, because I do think that this varies industry by industry, right? And like certain industries are just being hit right now, and it's tough, and they're just going to have to like weather this time period and hope we come out on the other end and that, things bounce back. I think for the industries where it's a little more ambiguous, to me, the rules are not that different than what they were before the pandemic. It's just they've been brought into like high definition. I think you've got to be constantly proving your value to your customers, not wasting their time. Really every single interaction that you're asking for someone's time or money, you need to be giving more than you're getting, and really thinking about people's time and money as a gift that you need to return in, tenfold. And truthfully, I think that, for a lot of people right now, they're really bored and isolated and have been separated from many of the things that bring them pleasure. And I think there's a huge opportunity to like come to the rescue. And if you can think about ways to just add a little bit of like delight to someone's day versus just trying to like come in with the hard sell, that's going to go a really long way. Because, for those of us who are fortunate enough to be safe and healthy and at home, we're looking for entertainment. And I think brands can really rise to the occasion and, find ways to surprise someone and break up their routine and build a really lasting love.
Fantastic advice, Emily. And hopefully this conversation is doing that as well, delighting everyone that's here.
I hope so.
Yeah, so let's take live questions now, and feel free to raise your hand, everyone that is still in attendance with us. We would love to bring your voice into this conversation. I will ask some questions that have been submitted in Q&A, Emily, and we have about 6 to 7 minutes to do that. So from Maria in the audience, how to brand specifically for Gen Z, and or is there a difference in branding and or marketing towards specific generations?
I think that these differences are often overstated. I think a lot of times the generation who's like coming of age at a specific period in time gets credited for values that are actually like trickling up and trickling down across all generations. I'm seeing a lot of brands right now that are coming forward with like a very specific aesthetic that's clearly trying to capture Gen Z. And I'd be careful in leaning into that too much, just because I think that like that's going to feel really trendy and dated really quickly. But at the same time, everyone everywhere is embracing like a rougher, less polished approach. I think we're all used to now sort of seeing, real-time content on social media, and certainly, things like TikTok are sort of giving us this very like raw approach to content that everybody's moving away from a more luxe, polished, like perfect vision of the world. So, there are ways to sort of see where trends are heading, but not get so bogged down in like, we're building this for Gen Z and therefore it needs to look like this. Because I think ideally, what you're building feels more universal than that.
Thank you so much, Emily. Excellent answer to this. Let's see. Theo, I would love to bring your voice into the room. Please ask Emily one of your questions. I know you had a few. So Theo, you should be unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Cool. So Emily, I've worked at both brand consultancies and agencies, and I find they have a very different approach to brand. So consultancies tend to create the assets first, the expressions first, and then move from there. And agencies tend to do the positioning or the brand story, whatever you might call it, first. Do you think those two processes are complementary or are they contradictory? What are your thoughts?
I've never worked anywhere that would do the assets before the strategy. So that's surprising to me that you've worked with brand consultancies that would do that, because we probably consider ourselves a brand consultancy. And for me, everything needs to start with strategy. Like if you're not clear on the story that you want to tell and why you want to tell it, you're just making aesthetic choices. And I think it's incredibly important that it starts with like a truth about your business. And in fact, even going back to the Gen Z question, right? It's like, what do you stand for? And maybe what you stand for is like super relevant to Gen Z or different generation or all the generations, rather than like, what font do people like right now? Or like, what's our approach to photography? So I think that if you don't start with the story and the positioning, you're always going to land in a place that feels shallow and far too influenced by like design trends of the moment, instead of a brand that's true purpose is like uncovering what your business is all about and why people should care.
Theo, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does answer the question. And actually, they usually do at consultancies something they call strategy, but it really is to lead to a design brief for assets and not for a brand story. So they might come up with visual components. So there is an element there that's called strategy. It's just not what I would call strategy. I've mostly worked at DB or Ogilvy. So that would be a positioning strategy, which, for me is very different to a set of strategic inputs that leads to a design strategy.
Okay, I see.
Theo, thank you so much. I'm going to mute you now. And again, anyone else that would like to share their voice, we would be happy to bring you on to ask Emily a question. To dive into another question here, Emily, that I know some of our early stage founders absolutely would be interested in hearing your response to. If you're not yet to product market fit, how would you advise thinking about branding, and how and what should you spend on that?
Meaning that you don't even have like meaning you haven't proven product market fit, or meaning that you're not even sure you have product market fit? Because there's a big difference.
That is a great question. So for the human that asked that question, please put it in the chat and or give us a little bit more of a definitive specific so Emily can answer that question. Absolutely. Emily, thank you for asking for specific. Let's see. We have some very broad questions around how you decide that when evaluating startups to work with, how do you know that they will be successful? Do you have a lens? It kind of goes back to your founder story and the 13 years of experience that you have. How might you be able to tell that a brand or a company will be successful?
Yeah, I mean, look, we don't have a crystal ball, but I think that we have enough experience of seeing like what takes off and what doesn't to have a pretty good lens. And I think, again, it goes back to what I was saying before about like, is this responding to a real need? You know, you can sort of tell when it's like, oh, someone was bored of their corporate job and came up with an idea for a business. And you're like, no one needs that. Like, you might need to start your own business because you hated your job, but like, there are not enough people out there who need what you're talking about. Or it's such a small piece of the puzzle that it could be like a very nice little niche business, but it's not going to hit the scale that, you know, we want to be partnering with. So I think that, you know, we're looking at sort of, again, corollaries, but we're also looking at our own instinct and intuition about what we know it takes. And then truthfully, we're counting ourselves as part of the equation. I mean, I don't know if that sounds like arrogant, but I think, you know, someone who's coming to us is going to invest in brand, and we're going to make sure they have a killer brand. And I think that really does help with success. Now, the product needs to be there. Like, we cannot be putting brand as like a veneer over something that isn't good, right? Like, that isn't ultimately, you know, going to make people's lives better and expect that to do the job, because you might get people to buy once, but we all know that the most successful brands have to be driven by like repeat, right? Repeat customers, lifetime value. But if the product's there and the idea is there, then we know that we can help complete the missing piece of the equation.
Emily, thank you so much. So we have about 1 minute left in this discussion. I know, so exciting. We have so many questions. So for you all that are still with us, please take a few moments to fill out the survey that we have in the chat. We absolutely can invite Emily on again. We can invite additional marketing experts that might be able to answer your questions. Let us know what your feedback is. We would love to hear from you. And Emily, before we hop off today, what are some final parting words of wisdom that you might want to share with this audience?
Ooh, pressure. So I think that a lot of times the feeling is, you know, I'm going to invest in everything else and then I'll wait, right? I'll wait for brand until I've proven traction. And all I'd say there is just beware of the false negative, because I think that you can have product market fit and you put it out there, and because you're not telling the story in a way that gets people attention and motivates them to try you, they're never going to find out that you have product market fit. So, you know, there are businesses that could have incredible potential to change people's experiences and lives, but if you're not packaging it up in a way that makes that obvious, you're never going to get there. So to me, you know, I get that it can feel expensive, it can feel time consuming, it can feel like the sort of last priority. But I think that what you don't want to have is a situation where like everything's in place but the story, and therefore, you know, you never get off the ground, because that's a real shame. And I'm sure you all have unbelievable ideas. And I think the key is helping people understand, you know, why your ideas are so powerful.
Emily, thank you so much. Absolutely. We are so grateful that you've been with us today, for taking the time to speak with our community, to share your insights and set such a great overview. On behalf of the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center and everyone in attendance today, we sincerely thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Loved all the questions. It was a great conversation. Thank you, Maria.
Absolutely, Emily. Thank you so much. So for
have a great night. Afternoon. Bye.
Thank you. So grab a hold of Emily's book, Obsessed, Building a Brand People Love from Day One. And if you would like to join us for future webinars and learn-ins, we would absolutely love to have you. We have upcoming Thursday, October 22nd, Kara Golden of Hintwater Tuesday, October 27th, introducing our Mentor Makers Live, a very big initiative that NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center is heading. And Tuesday, October 27th, how to grow a startup, the foolproof formula for finding product market fit. Again, to all of you here, we're so grateful to have you with us, and thank you for enjoying this discussion with us. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you again.